Hey friends, welcome back, or welcome for the first time, to another slow, soothing wander through the stranger corners of the past. Tonight, we're going to explore something as universal as sleep, and just as comforting when it's done right: food. Specifically, how people in the Middle Ages thought about eating, feasting, fasting, and everything in between.
But before we dive into steaming pots of porridge and questionable eel pies, take a moment to settle in. Maybe dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and if you're lucky enough to have a warm beverage nearby, let the steam curl up like the ghost of a medieval stew. This is your time, your soft landing after a long day. Maybe turn on that fan for a gentle hum. As you begin to drift into that half-dreary state, just imagine the scent of firewood, the creak of old timber, and the faint jingle of a dinner bell that was probably just a spoon being banged against a pot. Because food, like sleep, wasn't always easy, or predictable, or particularly hygienic. In the medieval world, eating was survival. It was also community, ritual, and occasionally a deeply suspicious act involving gravy and fish served with their eyes still in. So let's begin, slowly, with the humble peasant meal. Because before there were banquets with swans dressed in armor, there was bread. And that bread is more often than not the consistency of a roof tile. Let's imagine you're a medieval peasant. You've worked the fields all day, sowing barley, gathering hay, trying not to get kicked by a cow or taxed by a noble. And now it's time to eat. What's for dinner? Likely the same thing as yesterday, and the day before, and probably what's coming tomorrow too. Bread. But not the pillowy, crusty, gluten-aerated kind you're picturing. This bread was called black bread, and it was dense, dark, and made from rye, barley, or oats, whichever grain hadn't been devoured by rats, mold, or the miller's dishonest hands. It was often so coarse it could chip a tooth or double as a blunt weapon in a tavern brawl. Alongside this carb brick, you'd find pottage, a kind of medieval stew that was equal parts mystery and improvisation. Think root vegetables, wilted greens, and maybe a sad turnip floating in a cloudy broth, simmered for hours in a single iron pot. If you were lucky, there might be a bone in there, not for the meat, but to dream of it.
And then there was ale,
And yeah,
neki, that
Children drank it.
Pita.
Monks brewed it. Housewives watered it down.
Because water, you see, wasn't always safe.
A clear stream could be hiding 100 reasons to befriend the local gravedigger. Ale, on the other hand, was boiled, fermented, and surprisingly nutritious. Think of it as the Gatorade of the 13th century, if Gatorade made you burp and forget how stairs worked. Breakfast? Likely none. Lunch? Maybe leftover pottage. Dinner? More bread. But here's the strange part. Most peasants didn't complain. This was life. Predictable, filling enough, and if the barley harvest was kind and the local lord wasn't charging you taxes for using his sunlight, you might even have a little cheese. Yes, medieval cheese. Hard, salty, aged to a texture best described as survival grade. A good cheese could last months. Bad cheese might fight back. And this, dear listener, was the baseline of eating in the Middle Ages. Functional, simple, often shared with family, neighbors, and occasionally a suspicious-looking cat that wasn't yours, but was always nearby at mealtimes.
If you were a medieval noble, your meals weren't just meals. They were declarations of power, ritual performances, and sometimes barely disguised games of edible one-upmanship. Because what better way to show your guests that you're important than by making them eat a swan dressed in pastry armor? Let's set the scene. It's a banquet hall lit by dozens of candles and a few dangerously flammable torches. Tapestries line the walls, mostly to block drafts. A fire crackles in the great hearth, and on the long wooden table, silver platters gleam under gloves of dripping fat. The first course arrives. You expect something small, you are wrong. Imagine roasted boar's head, apple in mouth, flanked by baked eels arranged like question marks. Pies the size of wagon wheels, sometimes with live birds hidden inside, not to eat, but to fly out dramatically when cut open. Surprise, your eaters just give you a concussion. There's venison if the lord owns a forest, hare, pheasant, or herring if the hunt was good, and bread of course, but not the peasant kind. This bread is white, refined, and fluffyish, a sign of wealth and terrible digestion. To wash it down, wine, mostly imported, or mead if you prefer your sugar fermented by bees. Water, still suspicious, but wine diluted with herbs, now that's medicinal. And the spices, oh the spices, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and pepper. All imported, all expensive, all used so liberally that some meats were unrecognizable beneath the flavored camouflage. If it burns your tongue and makes your guests sweat, congratulations, you're rich. Then came the subtleties. No, not small details, but literal dishes called subtleties made of sugar, almond paste, or pastry shaped into castles, animals, or saints doing suspiciously lifelike things. Imagine biting into a life-size edible angel and nodding approvingly. It wasn't just food, it was a performance. Minstrels sang, jugglers juggled, and somewhere near the end of the fifth course, a roasted peacock in full feathered regalia might be carried out, redressed in its own plumage, and occasionally set on fire, just to impress the visiting bishop.
Did it taste good?
That's subjective, but that wasn't the point.
Emil said, "Look all the things I can make dead, cook flamboyantly, and serve in a bread trench shaped like a unicorn." Nobles didn't eat to survive. They ate to display power, wealth, and control over the absurdity of it all. And after 3 or 4 hours of chewing, tearing, gulping, and very little actual talking, guests would recline near the fire and politely pretend they could still breathe. Because nothing says elite dining quite like finishing your meal with gilded marzipan and the mild fear that you may never stand again. If you've ever worked in a modern restaurant kitchen, you know it's a place of heat, knives, clattering pans, and quiet existential dread. Now imagine that, but with fewer safety regulations, open fires, and the occasional rat the size of a shoe. Welcome to the medieval kitchen, the heart of every noble feast and monastery meal, and the site of frequent shouting. For wealthier households, the kitchen was a separate building altogether, because medieval people had a healthy fear of accidentally burning their homes to the ground, which was a fairly common outcome of over-enthusiastic roasting. Inside, the air is heavy with smoke and spices, fires blaze in their massive spits, huge cauldrons bubble ominously, their contents equal parts stew, soup, and mystery. Bread ovens glow orange like the gates of a yeast-based underworld. There's flour on the floor, salt in the air, and someone yelling about the fish not being angry enough. Because yes, in some recipes the fish had to look furious. Presentation was everything. The kitchen staff formed a small army. There were head cooks, undercooks, sauce makers, butchers, scullions, and occasionally a boy whose job was just to turn the spit, for hours, so that the roast boar would brown evenly and not come out looking like it had been cooked on one side by divine wrath. And then there was the turnspit dog. Yes, a real dog, small, long-bodied, and specially bred to run inside a wheel that powered the spit. Like a hamster wheel, but with more barking, the dog ran, the wheel turned, the meat rotated, and dinner, somehow, got cooked. Was it efficient? Sort of. Humane? Not especially. But the medieval world was full of strange solutions to even stranger problems. If it made the meat tender, it was worth it. Utensils? Rare. Most cooking was done with iron ladles, wooden spoons, and a robust sense of danger. Recipes weren't written down, just passed along orally. Measurements were vague. Add enough flour to satisfy Saint Honoratus is not exactly food network precision. Hygiene? Not a priority. If something dropped on the floor, you picked it up. If a rat died in the flour sack, well, you just hoped it was only one. Salt and smoke killed most things. Probably. But despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, these kitchens turned out meals for hundreds, and in monasteries the kitchen was equally busy, but with more rules and fewer peacocks. Monastic cooks served large refectories with dishes made under strict religious guidelines, no meat during Lent, no rich sauces unless someone important was visiting, no taste testing unless you wanted a lecture about gluttony. And through it all, the cooks endured, their brows sweaty, their fingers scorched, their tunics covered in flour, feeding the hungry mouths of a world that ran on bread, broth, and hope.
If you've ever tried intermittent fasting, you've likely done so for health, habit, or perhaps a vague sense of self-discipline. In the Middle Ages, fasting wasn't a wellness trend. It was mandatory, frequent, and often more about creative interpretation than spiritual denial. Let's begin with the church, that ever-present spiritual and social authority. The medieval church had very firm ideas about food. Too much of it was sin, gluttony. Too little could be a virtue, fasting. And the line between the two was often blurred by fish sauce and wishful thinking. Here's the basic rule. Meat was bad for the soul, at least on certain days. That included flesh from warm-blooded animals. So no pork, no beef, no chicken. But fish? Fish was fine. Why? Because fish were considered cold and wet in the hierarchy of humors, and since they lived in water and didn't bleed red, like land animals, unless you poke them, they were spiritually neutral. Possibly boring. Perfect. So the medieval calendar was dotted with fasting days, Fridays, Wednesdays, Advent, Lent, Ember days, vigils, rogation days, and special saint-related fasts. In total, nearly one-third of the year could involve some form of dietary restriction. But here's the thing, humans are clever and hungry, which means the medieval faithful developed an entire gastronomic gray zone. For example, beaver tails were considered fish by some monastic orders. Why? Because beavers swam, and their tails were very fish-like if you squinted hard enough. Barnacle geese, a real bird, were believed to hatch from barnacles, so naturally they didn't count as birds, they were honorary fish. Whale meat, depending on the bishop, also fish adjacent. Otters and puffins, occasional fish status, awarded by desperate theologians and even more desperate diners. Fasting didn't mean no food, it meant no meat, no dairy, and ideally a spirit of restraint. But rich monks and nobles often found ways to turn fast days into a feast of fish and indulgent loopholes. Some monasteries had better food during Lent than outside it, because they had saved the best fish, eggs, and cheese alternatives for these supposedly austere times. Even the Holy Desert Fathers, saints who retreated into caves to live on honeycomb and spiritual virtue, were sometimes depicted in later stories eating magical bread or being brought gourmet meals by ravens. Fasting, it turns out, had a PR department. And then there were the truly devout, ascetic saints who starved themselves as acts of holiness. Saints who lived on a few grains a day, or who refused food altogether, claiming to be nourished solely by divine light or the Eucharist. Others, like St. Catherine of Siena, reportedly consumed almost nothing but communion for years. Today, we probably call that dangerous. Back then it was seen as evidence of spiritual strength, or at least the refusal to eat what was served. In truth, medieval fasting wasn't always about food. It was about control, virtue, and the eternal medieval tension between body and soul. What you ate was a window into your spiritual discipline, or, at the very least, how good your cook was at making ale mousse. In today's world, dinner etiquette might mean knowing which fork to use, chewing quietly, and pretending to care about the quinoa salad. But in the medieval world, table manners were less about grace and more about not starting a feud with the person next to you. Now let's begin with the trencher. This wasn't a utensil. It was your plate, made of stale bread. Yes, bread. Thick, hard, usually a day or three old. A medieval trencher could double as a small shield or chew toy for a determined dog. Food was piled onto it. Meat, sauce, vegetables. And once you were done, you had choices. Eat the trencher, soaked and softened by the meal. Give it to the poor, a kind act, assuming it hadn't been licked by a dinner guest. Throw it to the dogs. Tableware was minimal. Knives were personal items. You brought your own. Forks were rare and controversial. In some places, using a fork was seen as effeminate or even blasphemous, because fingers were God-given and forks were weird. Spoons existed, but they weren't guaranteed. If soup was served, you might drink it straight from the bowl or tilt your trencher and hope for the best. Now let's talk communal eating. Most meals were shared from large platters. You didn't get your own serving. You got a portion on the platter, which meant your neighbor's habits became your business. If they ate quickly, you got less. If they sneezed, you got flavor. If they were generous, you counted your blessings. Sharing wasn't just common, it was expected. You might even be required to share a drinking cup or a spoon. Monks, soldiers, and students often lived in close quarters and ate side by side, elbow to elbow, in what amounted to edible team-building exercises. So how did you behave? Carefully. Rules of etiquette included: don't blow your nose on the tablecloth. This was a problem, enough to need repeated instructions. Don't scratch fleas during dinner, even if everyone had them. Don't dip your meat into the communal sauce bowl after biting it. That was for everyone. Don't talk with your mouth full, even if you had something very important to say about that goose leg. And whatever you do, don't spit across the table. Spitting was a common bodily function, but tables had boundaries, ideally. In fancier settings, a carver might slice the meat and a server might offer it to you with a practiced flourish. Accepting it with both hands and a quiet bow was polite. Taking the largest slice with a wink, less so. Hierarchy also dictated where you sat. The lord sat at the high table, with honored guests. The closer you were to the kitchen door, the lower your status, and the colder your food, which was a metaphor really, for most things in medieval life. And while nobles had napkins, the rest of the population just used what they had. Their sleeves, their trencher, or if truly desperate, the table edge. Still, meals weren't stiff affairs. People laughed, sang, and occasionally broke into arguments about whose turn it was to carve the duck. Eating together was as much about social bonding as it was about food. A rare moment where class, chaos, and communion all met on the same board. Just be sure to wash your hands before and after, assuming water was available and that someone hadn't just used the basin to soak their corns. Imagine trying to keep a fish fresh in July without refrigeration. Now imagine trying to do that with a whole barn full of fish, half a pig, and a dozen wheels of cheese. That was life for the medieval cook. You couldn't just pop to the store for milk. You had to make it, milk it, or hope your neighbor owed you a favor. Let's begin with salt. Salt was everything. A preservative, a currency, and occasionally a reason to go to war. It was used to cure meat, rubbed into hams, fish, and sausages until they became firm, dry, and frankly a little sad looking. But they would last weeks, even months. Salted cod and herring were staples in coastal towns. By the end of the Middle Ages, dried fish was being shipped across Europe, often so hard it had to be soaked for days before it was chewable. Some records suggest you could sharpen a knife on a dried cod. Hopefully that was an exaggeration. Next, smoking. Meats were hung over slow fires, sometimes for days. This added flavor and repelled bugs, though it also meant everything tasted faintly of soot. Think of it as medieval barbecue, minus the sauce and with a higher chance of ash. Then came pickling. Vinegar was used to preserve vegetables, fruits, and even meats. Jars of onions, beets, eggs, and strange things floating ominously in brine-lined pantries like a witch's apothecary. If it could be dunked in acid, it could survive the winter. Fermentation also played a role. All and meat were easier to store than fresh water. Sauerkraut and soured milk were common in Northern Europe. Even bread went through fermentation with wild yeast, since packets of dry yeast hadn't yet entered the chaff. And then there were more creative methods. Butter was stored in animal bladders. Grains were sealed in pits or barrels lined with pitch. Some regions buried cheese to let it age, and sometimes forgot about it. Surprise cheese is better than no cheese. Fruit was dried in the sun or smoked near the hearth, though this made everything taste like wood, and apples had trust issues. The truly wealthy, of course, had ice cellars, deep stone pits filled with compacted snow or blocks from frozen lakes. These could keep wine cool and meat edible for longer. It was the medieval version of a walk-in fridge, but without the buzz of electricity, just a soft drip of melting ambition. But despite all their methods, food still spoiled quickly and often, which meant spices played double duty. They didn't just taste good, they helped mask flavors that might otherwise make guests nervous. That roast duck? Delicious. That tangy aftertaste? Definitely not botulism. Probably. In truth, the average person's relationship with food was seasonal, local, and often desperate. You ate what you could grow, dry, smoke, or solo. And if you ran out in February, well, we'll talk about that in our next segment. Because coming up, we descend into the darker, leaner months when hunger became real, food became memory, and the fear of famine haunted the winter wind like a cold, invisible wolf. We've talked about feasts, fish, and flaming poultry, but for most medieval people, those were rare exceptions. The real rhythm of the year was shaped by absence. The empty bowl, the bare cupboard, the aching gap between harvest and hope. In the medieval calendar, this period had a name, the Hungry Gap. It came every year, usually in late winter or early spring, after the stored grains had dwindled before the new crops had come in. Food that had been dried, salted, smoked, or pickled was now moldy, maggoty, or gone. You couldn't plant yet, you couldn't harvest, and snow was still threatening to drop by uninvited, so you stretched what you had. Bread got thinner, pottage got waterier, cheese was scraped, not sliced. You picked nettles, boiled dock leaves, chewed bark, and hoped the neighbor with the plump goose didn't notice your stare. Famine, too, was always waiting, not constant but recurring. A bad harvest could bring it. Too much rain, too little. War, disease, a frost in May, or just bad luck with the crops. Unlike modern food shortages, medieval famine didn't just mean scarcity, it meant death, desperation, and sometimes despair in public. People ate whatever they could find. Grass. Yes, actual grass. Boiled, chewed, and swallowed with closed eyes. Tree bark. Ground into powder, mixed into bread, and chewed like courage. Cats, dogs, rats. In cities, even shoe leather was boiled and served as soup. In some parts of Europe, there were whispered accounts of darker meals. Desperation at its most terrible. Hunger didn't just weaken the body, it warped the mind, it changed communities. Families turned inward, sharing became impossible. Theft increased, superstition thrived, and fasting, once a virtue, now blurred into survival. Even monasteries, with their well-tended gardens and storerooms, were not immune. They tightened rations, prayed harder, recorded famines in neat script with words like great suffering and unusual silence in the chapel. Cities suffered worst. With no farmland, they depended on trade. And when roads froze or markets collapsed, hunger spread like frost through stone alleys and wood-shuttered homes. And yet, people endured. They always found ways to make something from nothing. They learned to store, to share, to make humble meals that stretched and warmed. They leaned on hope, on each other, and on the belief that spring would come again, and with it, green shoots, fresh eggs, berries, butter, and bread that didn't break teeth. In the Middle Ages, a carrot was never just a carrot. A fish could be a virtue. A pear might whisper prophecy. Food, like dreams, could speak if you knew how to listen. Because medieval people didn't just eat with their mouths, they read their meals, interpreted them, turned them into metaphors for the soul. Let's begin with the Bible, the original cookbook of meaning. Bread wasn't just daily sustenance, it was the body of Christ, sacred, mysterious, and often broken with great ceremony. Fish symbolized Christ himself. Early Christians even used fish symbols to identify safe meeting places. Eating fish on Fridays wasn't just about fasting, it was a quiet ritual of remembrance. Wine, blood of Christ, joy and judgment in equal part. A cup could bless or betray, but it went far beyond scripture. Fruits, spices, herbs, and animals all carried meaning in medieval minds. Apples were tied to temptation and knowledge, not because they were inherently sinful, but because of the story of Eden. To bite an apple was to remember that first mistake. Pears symbolized affection and were often given as gifts between lovers. Sweet, soft, perishable, much like the feelings they carried. Garlic and onions were earthy, humble, and believed to ward off evil, including, allegedly, vampires, devils, and that one cousin who never left. Almonds represented purity and wisdom, favored food in monasteries and marriage feasts alike. Then there were the dreams. Dreamed of food? It meant something. To dream of milk was said to signal peace. Honey might suggest prosperity. A dream of eating meat? Possibly a sign of conflict ahead, or a suppressed appetite for worldly pleasures. And if you dreamed of fasting, that meant a blessing was coming, or a stomachache, depending on your interpretation. Monks, mystics, and mothers all recorded dreams involving food. Saints saw visions of divine feasts. Pilgrims dreamt of banquets as metaphors for heaven. Even devils showed up with food, tempting the faithful with imaginary roasts and illusionary pies. Food wasn't just a symbol of the soul, it was also a message from beyond. This belief bled into folklore. Leave bread and salt out at night to keep fairies or spirits from mischief. Spill salt and you had to throw a pinch over your shoulder to blind the devil. If you cracked an egg and found two yolks, it meant a wedding, or twins, or both. Even the way food was served had meaning. A burned crust could be read as a warning. A perfectly risen loaf meant divine favor. A chicken that wouldn't cook? Witchcraft, obviously. In this world, the kitchen wasn't just a place of cooking, it was a place of divination. A bubbling pot might be more than soup. It might be a mirror into your future, or a message from your ancestors, or just a reminder to stir more often. And so every meal carried layers, physical, spiritual, and emotional. You didn't just eat to survive. You ate to connect with stories, symbols, and meanings that had simmered for centuries. Food in dreams, night cravings, and the quiet magic of the midnight bite picture. This is the middle of the night in a medieval village. Outside, wolves howl faintly from the forest. Inside, your straw mattress squeaks beneath you and your stomach reminds you that pottage wasn't quite enough. And so you rise, not with urgency, but with a slow, sleepy shiver. You shuffle toward the hearth, careful not to step on the dog, the baby, or the suspicious puddle. You're not alone in this moment. Across Europe, thousands are doing the same, because even in the Middle Ages, midnight snacks were a thing. After all, segmented sleep was normal. People often woke up in the middle of the night for an hour or two. They prayed, they tended the fire, they talked to one another, and sometimes they ate. These weren't full meals, they were comfort bites, crusts of bread dipped in warm ale, a sliver of cheese, maybe an old apple if you were lucky. Something simple, something to take the edge off the cold and the hunger and the thoughts that come when the world is too quiet. And those thoughts often led to dreams, medieval dream books, yes. There were entire guides on how to interpret dreams, gave a special place to food-related visions. Dreaming of bread was good luck, unless it crumbled in your hands. Then it was a warning. Dreaming of eating with a stranger, you might be visited by news or by someone with very poor timing. If your dream meal was interrupted, it might signal a betrayal or illness. Eating spoiled food in a dream could mean deception, or just that you actually did. Saints, monks, and mystics sometimes describe dreams where they were offered food by angels. Golden loaves, glowing wine, even celestial cheese, though no one ever explained what that looked like. Others wrote of dreams that involved refusing food, resisting temptation as a show of holiness. One famous mystic claimed the devil came to her in the form of a kitchen servant offering roast goose. She declined and woke up feeling victorious and very hungry. Even for the average person, food dreams were memorable. After all, food was never guaranteed. To dream of plenty was to dream of peace, of satiety, of things going well. To dream of hunger, that was a memory, not a fantasy. And then there were the folk beliefs. If you dreamed of cooking bread, it meant someone close to you was planning a journey. If you dreamed of spilling salt, you needed to apologize to someone. A dream about burnt food was a message from a forgotten ancestor. If you dreamed of eating something you could not identify, it meant you were carrying a secret, possibly even from yourself. It's hard to know whether people truly believed all of this, or whether it gave them comfort to assign meaning to the messier parts of sleep. But either way, the line between supper and dream was thin. The last crumb on the hearthstone, the smell of barley in the air, the sigh of someone next to you, dreaming of turnips and butter and the kitchen where the bread always rises. So here we are, after a long meal through time, through smoke and salt, through feasts and famines, and through 1,000 sleepy kitchens, tucked between river banks and old stone walls. We've watched peasants stir pots of thick pottage, their hands rough from work, their bellies grateful for whatever grew from stubborn soil. We've wandered through noble halls where food came gilded and glowing, meant less for hunger and more for spectacle. A roasted boast, a performance in pastry. We've crept through kitchens full of firelight and soot, where dogs turned spits and cooks muttered prayers to Saint Lawrence, patron of cooks and burned things. We've fasted with monks, dined on fish disguised as birds, and listened to saints dream of divine banquets with bread that glowed and wine that sang. We've sat elbow to elbow with neighbors at shared platters, where table manners were both a dance and a test, and where a misplaced spoon could turn into a misunderstanding involving three pigs and a fine. We've survived winters with salted meat and pickled roots. We've feared the hungry gap. We've learned to store, to stretch, to make something out of almost nothing. And we've followed those memories into the night, into dreams where apples mean affection, where bread crumbles into warnings, and where ghosts sometimes cook one last meal for those they miss. Through it all, one thing has stayed the same. Food meant more than food. It was community, it was ritual, it was identity. It told people who they were, who they weren't, and what they hoped to become. A loaf of bread could be an act of survival or a holy relic. A meal could be a celebration or a eulogy, and a crumb could carry comfort for hours. And now, as you lie back, eyes soft, body heavy, maybe already drifting, just imagines the quiet after a medieval meal. The fire low, the spoon set down, the last crust tucked away for tomorrow. Maybe there is a candle flickering, maybe a child snore nearby, maybe a cat curled up on the warm stones. The kitchen is dark now, the feast is over, the hunger is at bay for now. The world has settled, and so, at the long wooden table of history, you can rest your head. You've eaten well, now in spirit, in story, and perhaps even in sleep. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be full of bread and never burn.